Hello chess friends and welcome to Zarov's chess channel and welcome to the Altibox Norway Chess Tournament in 2020. We're now already in the round 4 and of course the derby of the day. It's Magnus Carlsen versus Fabiano Caruana. So the first player of the world against the second player of the world. We have also the repeat of the World Championship match in 2018 and that's the match we have waited now I think in this tournament because Fabiano Caruana really started so good in this tournament. He had 2 direct wins. He didn't win any games in this Armageddon. He didn't have to play the Armageddon game, but then yesterday he lost his first game in the Armageddon against Alireza Firuza. Now if Magnus wins now this game, he has the opportunity to take the lead in the tournament. So let's check out now what happened. I really was expecting not such a great tactical battle because both of these players, Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana, are great positional players, great pragmatic players. They will punish every little inaccuracy by you. And here I really wanted to also see what has Magnus prepared here as an opening, because we have seen now, for instance, Fabiano Caruana plays very well with the black pieces. He has a good opening preparation with the black pieces. For instance, the Queen's Gambit decline. I think this is a solid opening that Fabiano most often plays. And in the game, Magnus opened with the move d4, which wasn't a surprise for me because the d4 move is a more positional move than maybe just to play the move e4 immediately. Knight to f6, we have c4 and e6. After knight to c3, bishop to b4, so the Nimzo Indian. And here, Magnus in some occasions played the move e3, knight to f3 was also one of his choices. He played also in some occasions the move a3. Now Magnus goes for the classical variation with the move queen to c2. So all of these lines are possible. The main idea about this setup is that we can recapture with the queen and we don't risk this double pawn structure in the center, and still we could also make a progress with the potential e4 move. So castling, we have a3, kicking away the bishop, bishop takes c3, and now comes queen to c3. d5 played by Fabiano Caruana. The main idea is of course to keep now a compact position. If c takes d5 happens, I think we can simply take e takes d5, and then as I always like to say, this pawn structure is static, although you have the bishop pair on the board, but the bishops need dynamic positions. The bishops really need some pawn breakthrough motifs, really some open games. Now the pawn structure in the center would be static, so that's why here Magnus proceeded with the move bishop to g5 and creates really this annoying pin by the bishop on the knight. We have d takes c4, queen takes c4 played by Magnus, and we have now b6. This d takes c4 idea was really sort of a decoy by Fabiano Caruana because he wants to play this very aggressive bishop to a6 move. And the problem of whites is now that if you try an early e3 move, then we can simply play, as I said, bishop to a6 and simply taking the bishop on f1. White will never be able to castle anymore, although, as I said, white's main advantage is the bishop pair, but still you need many moves in order to secure the king. You need at least one pawn move, at least one bishop move, knight move, and then only you can castle. So here rook to d1, Magnus delays the castling situation even further. So even if you play something like g3, then you see you get bishop to b7. So it's so far a good line that Fabiano Caruana has played here. So as said, after b6 we have rook to d1 and now bishop to a6. Anyway, queen to a4 attacking the bishop, and we have now h6. The problem now of blacks here is in this position is that you cannot play the move knight from b to d7. You would love to play that move because the knight would be protected, and after something like bishop to f6 we could still recapture with the knight, so we wouldn't have to weaken the pawn structure in front of our king further. But now the knight is a little bit stuck to the defense of the bishop on h6. So h6, if queen to d5, that could be releasing pressure idea, simply attacking the bishop. I think we could simply take bishop takes f6, g takes f6, although the position is equal, but still you're continuing the game with the weird pawn structure, with the weakened pawn structure. And I think from this point on, white's main strategical idea would be simply to go as fast as we can into an endgame and punish this pawn structure with by creating maybe a pass pawn situation. So after the move queen to a4, here h6, bishop to h4, we have queen to d7, trying really to simplify the position further. Queen to d7 is not so good because knight to d7 will happen, and I think now black from this point on has really a good position, has at least an equal position, and the queens are off the board, so the position is more and more simplified. So that's why Magnus retreats with the queen. He doesn't want to simplify the position. He wants still this position to be complicated because, as I said, we have still the bishop pair on the board. Queen to c6. We have queen takes c6 now finally, but now knight to c6. That was Magnus Carlsen's main idea. Okay, when we have to trade off the queens, at least I want provide some weaknesses, so that's why Magnus traded off the queens on c6, not on d7. Now he can create again this weakened pawn structure with the move g takes f6. Now e3. Magnus it's still an equal position, but Magnus really loves to play these types of positions. Where he maybe can punish a little inaccuracy by you. We have bishop to f1, king to f1, and now knight to f5, knight to f3. We have knight to c4 attacking the pawn on b2, and now rook to b1. Okay, still an equal position, but it seems to me that the black's activity is perfectly fine here with the knight. But the problem is now that you always have this backward pawn on c7. That's the main target, I think, that Magnus Carlsen has seen here. And in the game, that's why Fabiano Caruana tried to improve the pawn structure with the move c5. But still, after potential d takes c5 and b takes c5, again, you have a further weakness. It's, of course, an isolated pawn. So you are continuing after potential c5 with an isolated pawn, and also here with a double pawn structure. So there are two slightly weaknesses in black's position. White, I think, has none, because white has a really good position. The pawn structure is not weakened. This is a firm pawn structure, and the only thing that we want to do, the only thing that we need to improve in these types of positions, simply get our king somehow to a2 and connect the rooks. The rook connection is a very important stage now that you should search here. So king to e2, we have rook from f to c8, we have rook to c1, and now knight to d6, and Magnus simply takes. If black plays, for instance, something like c takes d4, then of course we want to capture with the knight. We don't want to capture with the pawn where we could have an isolated pawn. So knight to d4, and now I think there is always a good path for the knight to get it somehow active. Also maybe attacking somehow this weakness, or maybe this weakness. Also maybe doubling up the rooks on the c file, trying maybe a b3 idea. So this position is also playable for both sides, but as I said, I simply like more white's position because white doesn't have weaknesses so far. Knight to d6, we have d takes c5, we have b takes c5, and now rook to c2. A simple idea by Magnus, simply attacking the weak c5 pawn. Knight to d2, we have c4, and now rook to c1. Rook from a to b8, we have to get this last piece into the game. Knight takes c4, knight takes c4, rook takes c4 doesn't bring you so much, because we can simply create this in-between check and then trade off the rooks. Our rook would be on the second rank. Of course, you want to get your rook on the second rank. From white's perspective, you want to get your rook on the 7th rank. That are the main endgame techniques that you should also search. So here Magnus tried to move king to f3, escaping simply with the king, getting into a position where the king cannot be endangered by the rook, by the knight on the board. Here we have c3, played by Fabiano Caruana, a risky idea to sacrifice the pawn just to provide further weaknesses, and Magnus accepts the challenge with b takes c3. There is maybe also line, maybe something like rook to c5, trying at least to protect your pawn, after something like b4, attacking the rook to c6, and now after knight to e4, getting maybe into a more simplified line. The problem of whites here in this line is that you cannot basically attack the pawn with the king. The king can always be kicked away with this other rook, and if our pawn is too much threatened by these rooks, still we can protect it with rook to c8. Still, white is slightly better even in this line, but I think it's a drawish position for both sides. So risky choice, as I said, c3 maybe. Here this idea rook to c5, getting this rook very active. So c3, b takes c3, and now rook to c5. We have c4, Magnus protects the pawn, and now f5. King to e2, we have king to e7, king to d3, king to d7, and now rook to c3, protecting simply everything. And now comes really a weird idea here by Fabiano Caruana. He plays the move rook to c6, and the problem is now Magnus can advance the pawn further. So okay, Magnus is one pawn up, but when you're facing these types of position, you should always play a blockade against this advanced pawn. You should never allow this pawn to make further progress. And now with the move rook to c6, here Magnus uses this moment immediately. As I said, if you give Magnus a simple slightly chance, he will punish you. Here c5, a great move. Better idea maybe something like king to e7, simply trying maybe a repetition of moves, maybe not further weaken any structures here in black's position. As I said, rook to c6 and now c5, kicking away the knight. Knight to e8. You see now the knight is passive on the square d6. At least the knight had some kind of an activity. Now knight to f3, Magnus gets this knight into the game. Rook to a6 and now knight to e5, attacking the king. King to e7 and now king to e2. Again, we are not risking some checks. If you try rook to b2, it's not a problem. Again, we can hide our king, but now the rook is a little bit out of game. We could simply push this pass pawn further. So after the move king to e2, we have knight to f6, rook to c2, and now knight to d5, rook to d3, attacking simply the knight, and we have rook to c8, rook to b3. Magnus searches now really for opportunities, and again, we have still the opportunity to advance the pawn further because the knight is on a very active square. Rook to c7 and now rook to c4, rook to a5 and now knight to d3. This is a nice idea of Magnus Carlsen. He wants, of course, first to have this protection, but there is also this idea to get maybe something like knight to b4, forcing a further trades of pieces, and then maybe to connect the pawns with 8 takes b4. This could be also a nice endgame technique to get these pawns connected, so you would then play much more freely with your rook. If this pawn on c5 would be protected by the pawn on b4, then we could use this rook, maybe attack this position from this side. So e5. Now I think comes the crucial mistake here by Fabiano Caruana. What he was thinking, of course, is after potential knight to e5 that black will simply get this pawn back and maybe get rid of this very annoying pass pawn. But here Magnus simply takes, and a better idea is maybe something to simply play something like rook to a6, getting again your rook back and try really to again play the blockade. Simply the blockade idea is very important to never allow this pawn to advance. But again, e5, this was, I think, the second inaccuracy here played by Fabiano Caruana. Magnus simply takes, knight takes e5. Okay, we have rook to c5, rook to c5, but now you see the problems. This rook comes on the 7th rank. As I said, the main ideas, the main strategies in this endgames is simply to get our rook on the 7th rank from black's perspective, of course, on the 2nd rank. And now Magnus is simply faster. Rook to b7, we have king to e6, knight takes f7, grabbing another pawn, rook to a5, but now first a check. That's the great tactic, and now we can protect our pawn. So Magnus has now an advantage of 2 pawns and didn't lose any pawns. He has still a good position, and now he threatens also this fork on b7. So that's why rook to a6, we have knight to f7, king to c5, knight to e5. You have to regroup, you have to get your pieces again glued together. And now h5, played by Fabiano Caruana, king to d2, we have h4, knight to d3, getting this check, and here after king to c2, rook to d6, and now knight to f4. Here in this position, Fabiano Caruana resigns. So okay, whatever you do, knight takes f4, we have e takes f4. If you try something like rook to g6, still we can have these pawns connected. This is simply, I think, too much to handle because we have the 4 versus 2 situation on the king side, and as I said, in this position after knight to f4, Fabiano Caruana resigned. So it wasn't maybe the most attractive of games, but this is simply Magnus' style. When he faces such a strong opponent like Fabiano Caruana, he will play simply on slightly inaccuracies, slightly mistakes, and slightly improvements of position of minor pieces, really punishing every weak square in the position. So okay, Fabiano Caruana maybe made this mistake with c3 and also with e5, lost the game, and now Magnus Carlsen is in the lead after 4 rounds. Levon Aronian is on the 2nd place, and Alireza Firouzja is on the 3rd place. So far a great performance by the young Iranian. He can still turn things around as he's only 1 point behind Magnus Carlsen. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. I really didn't enjoy it so a lot. I most of the time say I enjoyed it a lot, but this was really, I think, passive game. It was simply a setup like this. Okay, if you want to see more games from this tournament, check out my commented chess games here from the Altibox Norway Chess tournament in 2020. And if you want to see the best chess games in history, check out my best chess games of all time series. And if you like this content, you can also subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.